Welcome back to the Daily Survival. Now, South Africa's energy regulator, NERSA, has approved generating licenses for 3 controversial floating power plants, stoking environmental concerns as Africa's most industrialized nation grapples with electricity shortages. Now, Turkish-based Powership, one of the world's largest floating power plant operators, in March won a government tender to supplement South Africa's fragile electricity supply with gas-to-power projects at 3 points. Now, the Environmental Ministry had subsequently blocked Powership's permit application over concerns about the environmental impact. Now, joining me now from Greenpeace is the organization's climate and energy campaigner, Thandile Chinyavanhu. Thandile, good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us here on ITV Networks.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for having me.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Okay, Thandile, I just want to start off, of course, with regards to the Environmental Ministry that subsequently blocked the permit application. Of course, a couple of 1.5 years later, it seems that, of course, this has been granted by NERSA. When one talks about the environmental problems, as Greenpeace, what are some of those that have been seen and, of course, are cause for concern?
Of course, thankfully, the DFFE did eventually renege on the decision to grant Powership an environmental authorization, and a number of issues were pointed out by civil society organizations as to the issues that have been completely ignored with the initial granting of that environmental authorization. And some of those issues are the position that these ships are based in. They're in coastal areas, and they would definitely have a severe impact on the marine life in those areas. These ships are essentially floating power stations, and there are a lot of environmental regulations that are governing these activities. And so a lot of things would ultimately arise from the Powership operations. A number of issues regarding water pollution, air pollution from the emissions that will be generated from these ships. And of course, effluent will be pumped from these ships into the oceans, because these operations generally will create quite a bit of waste. But a major issue that was brought up by one of the environmental organizations based in the Eastern Cape was that this is a particular issue, as the noise that is generated by these power stations would have a severe impact on the marine life and ultimately affect the fisher communities that are living in these areas and depending on fishing as a livelihood.
Thandile, let's start off, of course, with the gas to power, because a lot of people would say, well, gas is much cleaner, obviously looking to the net O2, which a lot of countries want to implement, come 2026 and beyond. So how dangerous is it when one talks about gas? Because, of course, it just takes one technical fault and there can be a major disaster that could happen. So when we talk about gas, could you maybe just give us an explanation as to the pros and the cons to it, and of course the environment around it?
Well, of course, gas is quite a dangerous substance as a fossil fuel. Of course, we're aware that in South Africa, as of late, we have had a number of environmental disasters related to the use of fossil fuels. If you recall the oil spill in Umbilo River just last year, and even a bit earlier last year, there was the oil spill off the coast of Mauritius. So when it comes to the transportation and the use of fossil fuels, there will definitely always be environmental risks at play. And there is no way for these companies to guarantee that they can use these resources in a safe manner. We've seen for decades oil spill after oil spill, and the same will be definitely for gas. And there are definitely occupational hazards that are related to this. But one of our major concerns as Greenpeace Africa is the role that gas will play in our emissions trajectory. So just this week, the South African government has released the updated nationally determined contributions that we will take forward to COP26. And honestly, this was not a very ambitious NDC. And for the past year, Greenpeace Africa and a number of civil society organizations have been campaigning against the the NDC and its lack of ambition. But it's quite clear that our government is committed to fossil fuels, and particularly they are committed to developing gas in South Africa, which will most definitely lock us into a high emissions trajectory and definitely push us over that 1.5 degrees Celsius tipping point that we are trying to avoid to ensure humanity's safety. But unfortunately, this Powership project, which we will continue to campaign against, was not seemingly included in this nationally determined contributions that our government put forward. So it seemed to be quite in contradiction to what they had proposed in terms of reducing our emissions, because it would definitely contribute to greater emissions in the country.
Thandile, you spoke earlier on about the fishing communities in and around where Powerships and these actual ships will be based in. And we know that the fishing industry, of course, took a bit of a hit during the pandemic, and these are, working class families who rely on these industries to really feed them and, of course, generate them in terms of revenue. As civil society, has Greenpeace spoken to these fishing communities, and what are their concerns, ahead of these power plants coming through into the sea?
Greenpeace Africa and a number of its organizations have communicated with these fisher communities and have developed relationships with them. And it's quite clear that they're concerned that not only are these power ships going to affect their livelihoods and their ability to fish in these areas, because ultimately they will cause the fish to disperse from the areas that they usually would populate, but they're concerned about the air quality that these power ships may have on their environment, how it may affect the aesthetics as well, because honestly, these areas are dependent on ecotourism. They are areas where people travel there specifically because they are going there to enjoy the tourism in the area. And unfortunately, these power ships, which should be quite an eyesore as well as a public health nuisance, will definitely impinge on people's ability to be able to create livelihoods from the ecotourism industry in these areas.
Thandile, could there have been another source of, whatever, be it fossil fuels that do not affect the environment? Could there have been another way for government to sort of, first of all, delay what could have happened, and number two, source somewhere else for there to be, a source of energy that would not affect the environment? From a Greenpeace perspective, do you feel that government could have done more to sort of say, look, we can find a more cleaner and more environmentally friendly way in order to make sure, number one, the environment is not affected, and number two, the country can have its necessary amount of power?
Well, the reality is that there is no such thing as a clean fossil fuel, despite what you might hear government officials telling you about clean coal. That does not exist. Fossil fuels will always have an impact on the environment, and they will always have an impact on public health. And it's quite clear that our government has set aside the public's right to an environment that is safe and free from harm in favor of profits. And ultimately, that is
Okay, we seem to have lost Thandile there. She was just giving us, of course, a bit of a idea of what Greenpeace, along with other civil societies, are doing, in mentioning, of course, the pros and cons with regards to these power ships that are coming through. And what's interesting, as she, of course, elaborated on, is that as much as, and I think we do have Thandile back. Thandile, thank you so much. Looks like technology is against us. We're going to have to ask you, though, to put your camera back on to landscape. There we go. Thank you. I think we can, yeah. There we are. Perfect. Thandile, you were telling me, of course, about government and maybe the reluctancy of maybe searching for another form of a resource where power could have been. Okay, we're going to have to ask you to unmute there, Thandile. Thandile, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay,
Thank you.
You may continue.
As I mentioned, despite what you might hear from our Minister of Minerals, Energy and Resources, there is no such thing as clean coal. And despite what they may say to you, there is no alternative that will allow for the protection of human rights and public health at the end of the day. fossil fuels will always have a direct impact on human health and the environment. And it's clear that our government has forfeited our right to an environment that is safe and clean from harm in favor of profits, and specifically profits of carbon majors such as Eskom and Sasol. But what we definitely want to see is our government prioritizing people, the informal traders, that are not prioritized in comparison to these carbon majors. And if the government really wants to do this, the only alternative for them is to really increase the share of renewable energies in our country. So the NDC had proposed a number of measures to allow for the reductions of emissions. And one of those that is the most powerful in terms of emission reductions is the Integrated Resource Plan for 2019, which speaks to renewable energy components. And these renewable energy components could contribute towards an emission reduction of 84 metric tons of carbon dioxide annually. And compared to all the mitigation measures, this is the most enormous of those mitigation measures. And so we definitely want to see the government scaling up on renewable energies, because we have not even begun to tap into our renewable energy resources in this country. We are blessed to have sunshine and wind that can generate a lot of renewable energy, but our government is reluctant to bring those on board and really exploit the renewable energy potential.
Thandile, I don't want to get into the political aspects of it, but it's quite clear that, and I'm sure you'd agree with me, there is a reluctancy to go wind and solar. So how do we now force, or sort of put pressure on government to go that route in terms of renewable energy? Because it's quite clear that renewable energy means a cleaner and healthier environment, whereas with fossil fuels, it's the complete opposite.
Well, what we need to do is really push for a coal phase out. And that is what internationally a lot of countries have been calling for. Just today, China has announced that it will no longer be financing coal development in other countries. And this is a massive move, seeing as though a lot of international countries, specifically the US and China, view South Africa and Africa as a whole as an emerging economy and an opportunity for them to continue to propagate this fossil fuels in our countries. You'd see that a lot of proposals for coal, which is really dying on an international scale, is trying to find its roots in African countries. And so these companies, and specifically international actors, are trying to milk as much as they can out of the fossil fuel industry while they still can. But the truth is, it is a dying industry, and we need our government to recognize this and shift away from fossil fuels and go into renewable energy so that we can really compete with the world on an international stage and be able to have energy security that honestly we have not had for at least 2 decades under the current administration, with load shedding and its continued issues.
One final question, Thandile. I see Outa's come out in their disapproval with what is currently happening with Powership, of course, coming through and officially now sort of getting the supply of power throughout South Africa. You mentioned various civil societies, including Greenpeace. What is the way forward now? Is there any action going to be taken to make sure that there could be a last-minute halt to Powership officially putting itself and sealing its stamp on supplying power to South Africa?
While Greenpeace Africa is disappointed and shocked in NERSA's decision to grant Powership a generation license, the reality is that it's quite inconsequential at this point. It's definitely government's influence over NERSA trying to get them to push for a generation license to be approved and to make sure that they can try and have Powership come online. But the reality is that they have failed to get the environmental authorizations. They failed to get the port authorizations. And in reality, it's just not looking like it's likely for them. And we're hopeful that our government will recognize this and the interests of the people will prevail over the interests of a foreign company that will just be here to allow for a legitimate capital flight.
Thandile Chinyavanhu from Greenpeace. She is the climate and energy campaigner. We say thank you so much for making the time for us.
Thank you so much for having me.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Well, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Of course, South Africa is in an energy crisis. We cannot run away from that. But is it going to be coming at the expense of our environment? That's going to be the big question to ask. While we do have renewable energies in solar and wind. But hey, you know what? There is someone's pocket that needs to be filled. So is this deal right over here, filling someone's pockets? Well, after the break, we'll be taking a look at our sports updates. Do stay tuned.